I could just do this, and maybe it'll film me now. I don't know. But that's not what's important anyway. Well, good morning. It's still morning? Yes? You notice some empty seats. I'm starting to bore people to death, I guess. Or people have colds or something. Or they're deployed, who knows. Well, so we were talking about, it's actually still a little early. By 2 whole minutes. So. We were talking about number one, how to live a good life, how to raise a good child so that the child would have a good life, be ethical, essentially. And of course, we're following the Nicomachean Ethics. We're following Aristotle's particular view of how to lead a good life. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of that is, unlike his teacher Plato, he doesn't believe in an afterlife. So for Plato and those who follow Plato's philosophy, depending on what period of Plato you're looking at, really, people think of the soul as the most important part of us, and the soul is corrupted by the body, so you want to protect the soul as much as you can from physical attachments, because those corrupt the soul. You want your soul to basically continue on in an ideal world, essentially. We might call it heaven, right? You know, a lot of people still today feel like getting into heaven is the most important part of life. So how do you live in order for you to protect your soul so that your soul isn't corrupted by your life? But for Aristotle, remember, the soul can't exist apart from the body. So there is no separate soul that is released at the death of the body. And so for Aristotle, the whole goal of eudaimonia, which I don't know if I explained that, but EU is good, daimon is like a demon, and so to be enthusiastic, really, to be full of enthusiasm of a good nature, right, is essentially eudaimonia. We might call it flourishing, as in English. But so for Aristotle, the goal of life is eudaimonia, and even though in English we mostly think of demons as evil, the word actually meant kind of an enthusiasm that could be good or bad, right? So EU on the front of it means it's a good kind of enthusiasm. So the goal for Aristotle is to have a good life, and essentially what you need are all the basic needs of the body taken care of. You want to be healthy, you want to have good food, you want to have comforts, all those kinds of things. You also want all the social relationships that we need in order to feel loved and love others and so on. But for Aristotle, the main difference is our ability to think, our ability to learn. All men want to know, or all men love to know. And so his goal is to live the life just, of course, the way he lived it. So basically being a scientist, really. If you think about it, what was Aristotle? He was a scientist. And so for him, that's the best way to live. But if you're going to follow Aristotle and essentially believe that the goal of life is to have a good life while you're alive and not focus on protecting your soul some way, I mean, they're still interconnected. So it's not a completely different philosophy, of course, than Plato. Notice the whole idea of focusing on knowledge is very close to what Plato was interested in doing, although there's a significant difference in wanting to be happy during this life by focusing on that kind of life, as opposed to thinking that somehow you're preparing your soul for an afterlife. Now that's a very significant difference. But when we talk about the post Aristotelians, those that we focus on as we might call it Hellenic philosophy or Greek philosophy. They might also call it Rome. When we get into the Roman philosophers, we think of that as also post-Aristotelian. So the Greek thought after Aristotle, and I usually like to set it up in a kind of a logical way. And the goal, of course, is how to have a happy life, here and now, for the most part, right? Here and now. Yes.
Are we gonna get into like hedonism and stuff like that?
Hedon is an element of happiness. So you can literally have a hedonometer and measure how much happiness someone is having, theoretically, or a hedonistic calculus. That was what the utilitarians call it, right? A hedonistic calculus, which today we think of a hedonist as kind of a derogatory term, but for a utilitarian, the goal in life is the greatest happiness, including for the greatest number. In fact, that's the principle of utility, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham is the individual that is the British philosopher that invented that. And one of the neatest things about Jeremy Bentham is he's still with us, even though he died. In his will, he required that the British University, the London University, bring him to all the meetings, and so they preserved his body, except the head is wax, but the body is actually his body, kind of mummified. They keep it in this glass case. And they take that whole glass case and they wheel it to all the meetings to follow his will. So he's still listed as in attendance at every meeting that they have. That's just hilarious.
Is it the Royal Society?
No, that's the university, the London University,
London.
I believe, is where he shows up. And this used to be in the lobby as you go into the main building on campus. And I remember one year, one of my students visited and posed in front of it and took a selfie and sent it to me in Facebook. So that was kind of neat. So he was still there. But so that's where we refer to hedons, but of course that is a Greek concept, the idea of pleasure. How do you measure pleasure? Yeah, how do you measure pleasure? How do you decide what a happy life is? Well, the way I like to think about the Greeks is to start off with one kind of point of view and work my way to the more and more social points of view. So the beginning one that I think of, perhaps closest, they like to think that it's most influenced by Socrates. Because if you think about the way Socrates lived his life, he was not working, was kind of a bum, kind of dressed like a slob, didn't even have shoes, just basically went to dinners. People invited him to dinner because he was fun to talk with, drove a lot of people crazy, right? But the general idea of being cynical is associated with Socrates. So the Cynic philosophy, which literally means the dog. In fact, there's a couple places where Socrates says, "By the dog," which was a phrase that they used. But the dog is, like we say, canine, right? The canine, you see the police van that has a canine on it because they have the dogs. So canine is a Greek word for dog, and it's related to the same word. You might pronounce it kinnick instead of cynic. Which way do you pronounce the letter C? You know, it's, if you look it up in Greek, it's K. So it would be kinnick. But what is the cynic point of view? And the one example that I guess is most some interesting pictures of Diogenes, as you can imagine. What do I think of as Diogenes' cynic philosophy today would be the individuals that are homeless because they want to be homeless. So, you know, we get into the question of homelessness and we think about, well, are they mentally ill, or are they just camping here temporarily while waiting for things that they have to be here in Anchorage for, and then they go home or something, but the people that are followers of Diogenes are people that want to have as little as possible attachments to the physical world while living in it. So they don't want a mortgage. They don't want a lease to have to pay rent. They don't want to have a job in order to pay the lease, the mortgage, the rent. They don't want to have bills that they have to pay. They don't want to have to do any of this stuff. They want to be completely free, like a dog, essentially. Not in a bad sense, but in the sense that, when you talk to a dog, does the dog look worried about war or about what Putin intends to do, et cetera, next, or the stock market, or they don't have worries. We're happy as long as we get our daily food and a place to sleep, and we're not freezing to death or whatever. Look at the dogs that run in the Iditarod. They're so happy. We're gonna run. That's their interest. So the dog philosophy, literally, and when we think of Diogenes, there's all kinds of stories about him. Some of them are really embarrassing. I would need a trigger warning to talk about Diogenes the cynic. So homeless, maybe ascetic lifestyle, but not attached to, say, a monastery or something of that sort, where you have rules. The cynic wants no rules, basically. Does whatever feels good at the time. So that's one way, one philosophical way of trying to have a good life. They're trying to have a good life, and for them, they want to avoid all the stresses that you would have to have if you wanted to have a home and a family and a job and all those other kinds of obligations. So the cynic, I don't know very many really today. I guess there are those. How do you meet them? Do you go to the homeless camps and see how people are living there? How many people want to be, just living in a tent, stuff of that sort? Could be one of the famous stories about Diogenes was that he was lying in the sun, and Alexander the Great came up to him along with one of his generals, Ptolemy, and he had heard that Diogenes, the famous cynic, was lying there. So he went over to say hello. And as he stood there looking at Diogenes, he introduced himself. He says, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And Diogenes looked at him and said, "You could step out of my sun." Ptolemy famously thought, uh-oh, that's the end of Diogenes. But instead, Alexander said, if I weren't Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes. Okay, so story about him. There's a lot of bad stories though. Yeah, one was that he would stand on a pillar and masturbate in front of people. You know, he was a beggar too. I mean, he asked, for money or food or whatever. That's the comment, by the way, I